I heard the beacon grow loud enough to drag our fighters into empty sky. My superiors wanted numbers, but the rhythm under my headphones would not stay honest. Each time the long beat slipped, the margin in Murmansk shrank without anyone seeing it. I wrote the time anyway, and waited for the next explosion to prove what a signal could steal. On October 14th, 1942, the Soviet far north was entering its long season of darkness. The Kola Peninsula and the approaches to Murmansk were already under blackout discipline. Supply ships still arrived, and aircraft still flew, but every movement was measured against the Luftwaffe's reach. German air units based in northern Norway continued to probe the coast for openings. Soviet air defense along the Barents Sea relied on a thin chain of radar sets, observers, and radio listeners. Weather, bi-auroral interference, and mountains often broke that chain into isolated fragments. At this time, British and American cargo was flowing into Murmansk, and the port remained a priority target. The operational situation was simple and unforgiving. Night raids were expected and fighter units were kept at readiness in limited numbers. If the warning net was pulled toward a false signal, the fighters would chase empty sky, while bombs fell on the port and the ships in the roads. The North had learned to read the enemy's methods. The Germans used darkness, low cloud, and long overwater approaches to complicate interception. They also used radio navigation aids to keep formations on track when landmarks vanished. Some of those aids could be heard on the coast, like a metronome behind the static. The Soviet side listened for them as closely as it watched the radar scopes. Not every station had radar. Many had only headphones, a direction-finding loop, and a logbook that filled by the hour. The work was routine until it was not. The primary anchor in this story was a small radio listening post outside Polyarny, on a rocky rise above the inlet. Its duty was narrow. It monitored a set of known German frequencies and reported bearings and changes to the fighter direction room in Murmansk. Its measurable constraint was time. From the first audible signal to a usable report, the station aimed to deliver a bearing in 2 minutes, before the air picture shifted again. Senior Sergeant Ivan Sokolov was the senior listener on the evening shift. He was not a pilot and did not see the bombs fall from the air. His world was a wooden hut, a hand-cranked generator for backup, and a receiver that drifted when the temperature dropped. He wrote in pencil because ink froze. He had a simple procedure card taped beside the set. Frequency, signal strength, pulse pattern, bearing, time, then a call to the control room and a copy of the report to the unit file. At 1610 local time, the station ran its first check and noted unusual static, the kind that arrived with northern lights. At 1625, the telephone line to Murmansk tested clean, and the night duty roster was confirmed. At 1640, a coastal observer phoned in a visible change. A distant glow was seen on the horizon over the sea, low and steady, as if a lamp were moving behind cloud. It was recorded, but no alarm was raised. In the far north, moonlight and ice could create false glows. The early incident was small, and it could be shown on screen. Sokolov underlined the entry in the log because the glow lasted exactly 4 minutes, then vanished. By 1705, the listening post began to receive a faint repeating tone on a frequency associated with German navigation. The pattern was regular. A short burst followed by a pause, then another burst. It was the kind of signal a bomber crew could lock onto. The strength was higher than expected for that hour. Sokolov adjusted the tuning and watched the needle settle. He noted the pulse rate in the margin. Every 5 seconds, a clear beat. Every 20th beat, a slightly longer one. It was consistent enough to be intentional. At 1712, he took the first bearing. The loop antenna was rotated until the signal dipped. The needle fell, then rose again when the loop moved past the null. He held it at the deepest dip and read the compass scale. The bearing pointed out over the water toward the outer coast. He called Murmansk and gave the numbers. The controller on the other end acknowledged and asked for an update in 10 minutes. The night routine continued. A second listener checked the receiver's calibration. A corporal outside verified the mast guys were not icing over. A third man brought in a thermos of tea and a paper-wrapped ration. At 1730, the same signal increased in strength, as if the transmitter were closer. Sokolov wrote down the change, and he added a note. Pulse clean, no drift. This was unusual in the cold. Many transmitters wandered. This one sat on its beat like a clock. By 1800, dusk was deep. The port area began its full blackout. Trucks moved with hooded lights. Ships in the inlet held position or crept at minimum speed. On the airfield, fighters were lined on planks to keep wheels from freezing into soft ground. Ground crews kept engine covers on until the last moment. The Air Defense Command post in Murmansk kept one map board for radar plots and one for reports from outlying stations. In the absence of a clear radar picture, the rhythm of radio reports mattered. At 1815, the control room requested a confirmation. A separate post farther east had reported a weaker signal on the same frequency. That second report did not match Sokolov's bearing. A discrepancy of 15 degrees appeared on the map. The officer of the watch marked it in red. The difference could be error. It could also mean the signal was being reflected by terrain and the sea. It could mean something else. And it was too early to say. At 1840, the first concrete consequence arrived. A radar set nearer Murmansk reported intermittent contacts at long range, but the returns were uncertain in the clutter. The controller kept the fighters on readiness, but he shifted the patrol line north because the radio beacon suggested an approach from the sea. This decision could be shown physically. A grease pencil line moved on the map board. Phones rang. A duty sergeant wrote a new instruction and carried it to the fighter readiness hut. At 19:05, the beacon's strength rose again. Sokolov took another bearing. It had shifted slightly west, then returned to its earlier direction. He compared it to the log. The pattern did not change, only the strength. That strength came in waves, as if the transmitter were being turned or moved. He reported the change. The controller noted it, but the wider air picture remained unclear. After 1920, the wind increased. Icing formed quickly on exposed metal. The listening post's antenna began to creak under the weight. A corporal went out with a pole and knocked ice from the guy wires. Inside, Sokolov's fingers stiffened. He pressed the headphone cups tighter to seal out the hut's wind noise. A slight hum appeared under the beacon's tone. It was not in the earlier records. He wrote, "New low hum, steady." At 1945, the control room ordered a standing patrol to be launched at 2000. 2 fighters would climb and circle north of the inlet, ready to be directed by radio. Fuel was limited in cold air. Each aircraft could not remain aloft long before returning. The measurable constraint became visible. A clock on the control room wall was checked against a watch. A time window was opened. The fighters' engines were warmed, then started, and their exhaust formed pale columns in the dark. At 2010, the patrol reported level at altitude. The controller gave them a heading based on the beacon and the uncertain radar returns. The pilots acknowledged, and their navigation lights stayed off. On the ground, the listening post continued to feed the same direction. For a time, everything looked like procedure. At 2035, the first sign of deception appeared in a way that could be shown on screen. Sokolov noticed the long pulse in the pattern was arriving early. Not by much, a fraction of a second. Then it returned to its expected place. It happened again 5 minutes later. His pencil paused over the paper. He counted the beats. He counted again. The change was subtle, like a drummer shifting a foot without changing the song. At 2050, he asked the second listener to listen on a spare receiver. The corporal put on another headset and confirmed the same pattern shift. The signal itself was stable in frequency and power, but the timing of the long beat was not. Sokolov made a narrow note. Long beat slides, not random. He had heard German beacons before. They were typically rigid. This one was choosing when to be rigid. By 2105, reports from coastal observers began to arrive. A distant engine noise was heard, not loud, but steady. Searchlights remained off, because the doctrine at that time was to avoid revealing positions. The controller in Murmansk waited for radar confirmation. The radar scope showed 1, then 2 brief blips, then nothing. The patrol in the air reported no visual contact. Cloud had thickened. They were flying inside darkness with no horizon. At 2120, a second concrete consequence landed. An explosion was heard from the port area. It was distant, muffled by weather, but unmistakable. Anti-aircraft crews began firing blind in predicted boxes, following older procedures. The control room's phones all rang at once. The port reported small fires. The patrol overhead was still north, still searching in the direction implied by the beacon. The cost of a wrong pull was becoming measurable. At 2130, Sokolov took a fresh bearing and found it unchanged. He listened for the long beat. This time, It was perfectly on schedule. Then, within the next minute, it slid again. The rhythm was not failing. It was being played. A micro-foreshadowing line fit his thought. But he did not say it aloud. The beat was doing work that a map could not show. At 21:40, he requested permission to contact the control room directly with an advisory note. The station normally sent only numeric bearings. Opinions were not part of the log. Still, the duty procedure allowed a special remark when a signal showed abnormal behaviour. He used that channel. He told the controller calmly that the pulse timing suggested either equipment instability or deliberate manipulation. He added a simple observation. The signal strength rose and fell like a transmitter that was not fixed. The controller did not dismiss him. He asked for one thing. Could Sokolov estimate whether the transmitter was moving along the coast or whether propagation was changing? Sokolov could not claim certainty. He offered a test. He would take bearings every 5 minutes and request a second station do the same, then compare. It was a small workaround, but it was a start. At 2200, the patrol in the air reported fuel approaching the return margin. The controller ordered them to hold for 10 more minutes, then come back. Another pair of fighters was being prepared, but the airfield had limited warmed engines and limited trained night crews. This was a physical constraint, not a plan on paper. If the patrol stayed too long, it risked landing on ice or ditching in darkness. At 22:10, the beacon tone rose sharply, louder than at any earlier time. It filled Sokolov's headset. The long beat arrived exactly on the 5th interval, then stayed rigid for 20 beats. Then the slide returned. He wrote down the time. He drew a small line under the entry. His pencil point broke and he sharpened it with a knife. Outside, the wind direction shifted. Snow began to blow in thin sheets visible in the dim shelter light. At 22:25, a report came from the second listening post. Their bearing was now closer to Sokolov's. The discrepancy had narrowed. The controller took that as confirmation that the earlier disagreement was error. He leaned into the beacon as a reliable guide. He planned the next interception based on it. At 22:40, another blast was heard in the port closer than before. A warehouse roof burned and a fire crew struggled under blackout rules. On the airfield, a ground crew heard the blasts and swore quietly while tightening engine covers. The fighters returned from patrol without contact, landing hard and taxiing in darkness. This consequence beat was visible. A landing light flashed briefly, then went dark. A mechanic ran with a chock and nearly slipped on ice. At 2300, the control room launched the second pair of fighters. The controller directed them toward the same sector. The beacon's rhythm continued. The radar screen remained unreliable. The coastal observers heard engines but could not locate them. This was the point where routine began to break into improvisation, even if doctrine insisted otherwise. At 23:15, Sokolov noticed something else. The low hum beneath the beacon had a second layer, a faint ticking. It was not a mechanical buzz. It was keyed, like a short code repeated under the main signal. He switched to a narrower filter and listened harder. The ticking came in groups of 3, then a pause, then 2. It repeated. He had no table for it. He had only experience. Where decoy beacons sometimes carried simple identifiers, a decoy that wanted to be believed might imitate those identifiers poorly. At 23:25, he made a decision within his authority. He wrote the ticking pattern and sent it as a special remark to Murmansk. He did not accuse the enemy of deception. He described what he heard and what was unusual. Then he asked a direct question. Had the control room seen this identifier before, on this frequency, in this form? The controller asked him to hold the line. A senior officer came onto the phone, brisk, tired, and alert. The officer asked for a repetition of the pattern. Sokolov gave it. 3 ticks, pause, 2 ticks. The officer compared it to a reference list. He did not tell Sokolov the list details. He said only that the known identifier for that beacon did not match. He then asked Sokolov for the bearing again, immediately. Sokolov provided it. The bearing pointed to the same coastal sector, but now the officer questioned whether that sector was real. At 23:40, the officer ordered a cross-check with an additional station, one that had a better direction-finding baseline. That station lay inland, where sea reflections were less severe. The inland station was called and given the frequency. Within minutes, their first bearing arrived. It pointed not to the open sea, but to a nearer point, closer to the Soviet shore. The mapboard received a new pencil mark. The intersection of lines fell on a stretch of rocky coastline that had no German base. It could be a ship. It could be a temporary transmitter. It could be a trap. After midnight at 0010, the signal strength rose again. Rusus and the long beat locked perfectly into place. The timing slide vanished. The signal sounded suddenly professional, as if a trained hand had taken over. Sokolov recognized a pattern in that change. The earlier imperfection had been bait. Now, the enemy wanted certainty. He wrote a calm sentence in the log. Signal corrected at 0010. The words were plain, but the implication was not. At 0020, the control room faced a procedural conflict. Doctrine said to trust the strongest, clearest navigational signal when radar and observers were degraded. The cross-check suggested the signal's location was wrong for an approaching bomber stream. If fighters were sent toward it, they would patrol above empty water while bombers came another way. If fighters ignored it, they might miss the only guide available. The decision had to be made in minutes. At 0030, a visible consequence arrived in the form of fuel and engines. The second pair of fighters reported they were climbing through cloud and were nearly on their endurance limit for searching. They could not loiter and could not chase far beyond the coast. Their controller asked them to hold a line closer to Murmansk, not the far sector. This was an unofficial adjustment. It deviated from the earlier plan tied to the beacon. The pilots acknowledged, and their voices were tight from oxygen masks and cold. At 0045, the beacon's ticking identifier changed. 3 ticks became 4, then returned to 3. Sokolov reported that immediately. He did not use adjectives. He used numbers and time. The senior officer in Murmansk asked him for one more thing. Could he determine whether the signal was coming from a fixed point or from something moving offshore? Sokolov offered the only method available. He would take rapid bearings and watch for systematic drift beyond expected error. At 1 o'clock, he began taking bearings every 2 minutes. He rotated the loop, found the null, wrote the scale, reset, and repeated. The numbers showed a slow drift, then a return. It was too smooth to be random. It suggested a transmitter being turned, or an antenna being rotated, perhaps from a small vessel. That vessel could hide in coastal clutter. It could operate briefly, then withdraw. It could be replaced. This was not a beacon meant to guide bombers. It was a beacon meant to guide the defenders away. At 1:15, the radar set near Murmansk finally produced a steadier picture for a few sweeps. A cluster of returns appeared southwest of the city, not north over the open sea. The returns were weak, consistent with aircraft flying low or scattered by cloud. The controller took the report and compared it to the beacon's direction. They did not match. This mismatch was the turning point. A system that could disagree with itself had to be resolved. At 1:20, the senior officer gave a clear order. The beacon was to be treated as suspect. Fighter direction would rely on radar when available, and on combined bearings from multiple posts, not on the single loud signal. It was a procedure change made under pressure. It was also a rejection of the enemy's attempt to set the clock. Sokolov heard the officer's tone shift from cautious to firm. He did not celebrate. He only continued to listen and report. At 1:35, the fighters were redirected toward the southwest sector. They were given a heading that cut across the inlet and out toward low cloud. The pilots asked for altitude guidance. The controller used the radar sweeps and the observer's engine noise reports to estimate height. The language was spare. Maintain 2000, turn right 5, hold. The fighters disappeared into the cloud again. At 1:50, another physical consequence arrived. Anti-aircraft batteries nearer the port began firing in a different direction, following the updated picture. Searchlights came on briefly, probing, then went dark. A flare fell and illuminated the snow for a moment like daylight. On the ground, a truck halted and drivers looked up. A low engine note passed overhead, then faded. The beacon continued to pulse in Sokolov's headset, loud and confident, yet as if it were still in command. At 2:05, the listening post's generator began to misfire. The main power line had dipped with ice and wind, and the backup generator was needed to keep the receiver stable. The corporal cranked the starter and coaxed it into a steady rhythm. The receiver's dial light flickered, then held. This was a small, visible beat, but it mattered. If the receiver went dark, the cross-check network would lose a key node. At 2:20, the inland station reported their bearing again. It still suggested the beacon was near the Soviet shore. The drift observed by Sokolov matched the idea of a moving transmitter. A decoy could be carried by a small craft or a temporary team. German units had operated in the north with raiding parties and small boats. The sea itself hid many things at night. The senior officer in Murmansk asked for coastal patrol boats to be alerted, but he did not delay fighter direction waiting for that. The air raid was active now. At 2:35, the fighters reported contact. Not visual, but a brief shadow against cloud lit by gun flashes below. They saw tracer arcs rising, and they flew toward the thickest fire. A bomber silhouette appeared for seconds. One fighter fired a short burst and broke away. The pilot could not confirm a hit in the darkness. Still, the engagement was real. It was the first time that night the fighters were in the same sky as the attackers. The decoy beacon had not brought them there. The listener's insistence on cross-checking had. By 2:50, the port reported fewer explosions. Fires still burned, but the pattern of impacts changed. A ship in the inlet had been hit by fragments and began listing slightly. A tug moved toward it, guided by a shielded lamp. This consequence could be shown without exaggeration. Men moved with buckets and hoses under blackout. A watch officer's face stayed unseen under a cap, but his hands were visible, steady, and quick. At 3:05, the beacon's pulse rate altered for the first time. The 5-second beat became slightly faster. The long beat returned on a different interval. It was as if the operator had realized the defenders were no longer following. Sokolov reported the change. The senior officer replied with a single instruction. "Continue logging. Do not be pulled." It was a small sentence, and it marked the moment the decoy lost its power over the room. At 3:20, the radar returns faded again. Auroral interference and weather reduced the scope to noise. Now the control room depended on observers and the radio posts. Sokolov and the other listeners were asked to provide bearings not just on the decoy frequency, but on any related emissions they could detect. German aircraft sometimes used short transmissions for formation coordination. They were brief and hard to catch. Still, the listener's training was designed for those moments. He widened his scan, then returned to the beacon. The decoy remained the loudest signal. It remained the least useful. At 3:40, a new consequence arrived on the ground. A fuel dump outside the port was found burning. The fire's glow could be seen from the listening post ridge as a low red smear under cloud. The corporal pointed it out through the door crack. Sokolov did not leave his headset. He noted the time and kept the receiver steady. In the control room, the duty officer marked the fire on the map and requested fire crews. The air defense did not stop because a fire started. It adjusted around it, as it always did. Before dawn, at 4:10, the fighters returned to base low on fuel. One landed with a rough bounce and damaged a wheel strut. The aircraft was pushed to the side by hand to clear the strip. Ground crews worked in silence, using shaded lamps. The pilots gave short debriefs. They had seen at least one bomber. They had fired. They could not confirm more. No one claimed a victory that could not be proved. In the north, claims were less important than preventing the next bomb from landing. At 4:25, the control room received a report from a coastal patrol boat. They had detected an unusual light offshore earlier in the night, then lost it. They could not approach fast enough in sea state and darkness. They heard nothing else. This was consistent with a small craft withdrawing. It was also consistent with nothing. The senior officer did not build a narrative on it. He added it to the file. At 4:40, the beacon continued, still pulsing, but now its strength began to fade. The loud confidence of earlier hours softened. Sokolov took a final bearing for the night's critical period. The drift had slowed. If the transmitter was moving, it was moving away. If it was fixed, its power was being reduced. Either way, the decoy phase was ending. At 5:10, the last scattered engine noises were heard by observers. Anti-aircraft fire ceased. Searchlights remained off. The port's fires were contained to smaller areas. Ships reported damage but not catastrophic loss. The airfield reported one fighter out of service due to landing damage. A warehouse was burned. A fuel dump had been partially lost. The cost was real and could be counted, even if it was not the worst that had been feared. At first light around 8:20, the senior officer ordered a technical inspection. A mobile radio team was sent along the suspect coastal sector with a receiver and a loop antenna. They drove on rough roads and stopped at points where they could take bearings. The decoy frequency was now silent. They could not find the transmitter. Still, they found something else. On a shoreline ridge, they found fresh footprints and a patch of ground where ice had been broken and refrozen. A small pile of cut wire lay under snow. It was not proof, but it was a sign that someone had worked there briefly. Photographs were taken, measurements were written, the file grew. By midday, at 1200, a debrief was held in Murmansk. The listening posts were asked to present their logs. Sokolov brought his pencil-written pages, edges curled from damp and cold. The senior officer read the entries without comment at first. He noted the early glow at 1640. He noted the strength rises. He noted the timing slides. He noted the changed identifier. He noted the moment the beacon corrected itself at 0010. Those marks were the outline of a deliberate deception. The discussion remained calm. No one accused anyone of negligence, not openly. Instead, they examined the procedure that had nearly been exploited. The doctrine that favoured the loudest. Thy's clearest signal had been appropriate when signals were assumed honest. That assumption no longer held. The solution was not dramatic, it was procedural. From that day, the control room required cross bearings from at least 2 stations before allowing a radio navigation signal to determine fighter direction when radar was degraded. A second change followed. Listeners were authorized to report pulse patterns and identifiers as operational information, not as technical trivia. The institutional response included training. A short bulletin was typed and distributed, with a plain title about enemy radio deception. It described in measured language how a decoy could imitate a beacon and how to detect irregularities. It emphasized timekeeping, cross-checking, and skepticism when signals became suddenly too perfect. It did not mention names. It did not need to. The lesson was meant to be repeated on night shifts by men who would never be photographed. For Sokolov, the aftermath was quiet. He returned to the hut the next evening and taped the new procedure card beside the receiver. He adjusted the loop antenna and checked the telephone line as before. There was no ceremony. A week later, a clerk handed him a short commendation notice for attentive monitoring under difficult conditions. It was not a medal. It was a piece of paper, and it carried the signature of an officer who had spent that night with phones to his ears. Sokolov folded it and placed it in his pocket without comment. The larger legacy was not a single interception. It was a habit that spread across stations. The North learned to treat radio certainty as another weapon the enemy could manipulate. The listening posts did not stop raids. They reduced errors. They narrowed wasted flights. They helped pilots meet aircraft in the right patch of sky, sometimes only for seconds. In a theatre where fuel, daylight and visibility were always scarce, those seconds mattered. On later nights, German signals would still appear and decoys would still be tried. Sometimes they worked, sometimes they did not. What changed in that winter was the discipline of checking rhythm against reality. A tone in a headset was no longer accepted as truth by itself. It was weighed against bearings, against radar when available, against the simple fact of where explosions were heard. The system became slightly harder to fool. The story's unsung work remained in the logbooks, pencil marks, times written in the margin, small underlines that signalled doubt. For viewers today, the visible drama is often in aircraft and fire. The quieter struggle was in procedures, in the patience to listen, and in the refusal to chase a signal just because it was loud. If you want more forgotten wartime stories built from real procedures and overlooked work, subscribe and stay with the channel.